Welcome to History Behind the Headlines. Is global democracy in crisis? This is a program of the American Historical Association, in case anybody has simply been wandering across the internet for the last few minutes. We'll want a minute or two for everyone to get settled into their Zoom connection. Often the internet takes a little bit of time to get everybody into the room. So let's wait about 60 seconds and then we will get started. Has simply been wandering across the internet for the last few minutes. We'll want a minute or two for everyone to get settled into their Zoom connection. Often the internet takes a little bit of time to get everybody into the room. So let's wait about 60 seconds and then we will get started. Okay, like all people who have taught in classrooms, I am not very good at actually waiting a minute when I say a minute. One of the first things we learn when we learn how to teach is how long a minute actually is. I'm Jim Grossman. I'm the executive director of the American Historical Association, the largest professional organization serving historians in all fields and in all sorts of workplaces and professions. The AHA promotes history education, the professional work of historians, and the essential role of historical thinking in public life, which is what is on the table today. If at any time during this conversation that you're going to listen to, you find yourself seized with the urge to join the AHA, please hold that thought. You'll get a link after the program, and maybe even we'll manage to get one up there before the end. We cannot do this work or the other things we do on behalf of history and the work of historians without the support of members. And I think many of you are well aware who read newspapers, watch TV news, of how important the work of historians is right now. This program is part of our History Behind the Headlines series, which features historians providing historical context for current events, suggesting how historical thinking can provide different angles on the world around us. History Behind the Headlines is generously sponsored by AHA member Jared Brubaker, and we are very grateful to Jared for helping us with this. Today's discussion, which will run until 4 p.m. Eastern Time, brings together 4 leading scholars to place the current controversies and questions around crises of democratic governance in historical context. Our discussion will be moderated by Ken Pomeranz, professor of history at the University of Chicago and past president of the American Historical Association. Ken's research has focused especially on China, and he is also involved in initiatives in Hong Kong, hence, in both cases, his special interest in today's topic. He is also a leading figure in the field of world history, including being the author of The Great Divergence, China, Europe, and the Making of the Modern World Economy. And Ken, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Thank you very much, Jim, and thank you everybody for being here. I will quickly introduce our panelists in alphabetical order, and then we'll speak in alphabetical order, each giving a quick introduction to what the crisis of democracy looks like in the part of the world that they know best, and then we'll have subsequent discussion after that. So we will begin with Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who is a historian who writes about authoritarianism, democracy protection and propaganda. She is professor of history and Italian studies at NYU. She has received Guggenheim, Fulbright, and other fellowships, and she's an advisor to Protect Democracy. She's an NBC opinion columnist, MSNBC, excuse me, a regular contributor to CNN and the Washington Post, and publishes live commentary on CNN, MSNBC, and other networks. She publishes Lucid, a newsletter on threats to democracy, and her latest book is Strong Men, Mussolini to the Present. She will be followed by Rafael Ioris, who is a professor of Latin American history and affiliated faculty at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver. He is also a researcher at the Institute for the Study of the United States in Brazil and author of several articles and book chapters on the history of development in Brazil and other parts of Latin America, and on the course of US-Latin American relations, especially during the Cold War. I will speak third. I've been introduced already, and then will be followed by Paul Zeleza, who is Associate Provost and North Star Distinguished Professor at Case Western Reserve University, a past president of the African Studies Association. He was educated at University of Malawi, University of London, and Dalhousie University. He's published 27 books, 5 short monographs, over 400 journal articles, book chapters, encyclopedia essays, and so on, and is on top of all of that, a respected higher education administrator. So Ruth, take it away.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here for this important occasion, and we've never needed history more than we do today. It's wherever democracy is in crisis, the historical record becomes something that's debated and often suppressed. So history isn't just in the headlines, history becomes the headlines because it becomes an asset to be captured by authoritarian forces. So I started out as a historian of Italian fascism, and it's interesting today we have in Italy a neo-fascist prime minister. Many would call her a conservative. That's what she likes to call herself, Giorgia Meloni. But it represents a lineage that runs through Berlusconi all the way back to Mussolini. So democracy it's easy to see democracy as highly challenged at the moment. And one could look at the global scene as almost dominoes that are falling as one country after another finds ways to suppress democracy. It's important that without historical examples, we might not know what we're seeing, because when we think about autocracy, we sometimes think about the German example where Hitler because he took so long to get into power, he shut down things almost immediately. Today, the Mussolini playbook is more how it happens, where they are first in a democracy and they chip away at that democracy. Today, we have electoral autocracy, where you don't shut down elections if you're not, in North Korea or it's communist one-party states. You keep them going and you game the system. So it's become harder for some people to tell where democracy is in crisis and when. And that's where historians can come in. The other thing I want to say, perhaps unexpected, is we are at a kind of inflection point in the struggle between democracy and autocracy. Our own country, America, is where things are, focusing now in a very intense fashion. However, we are seeing a reaction around the world against authoritarian methods that many people are not aware of it as a broad-based phenomenon because it's not covered in the media that way. We're living through a global renaissance of nonviolent protest. All over the world, there are countries having protests that haven't had such large ones for many decades or ever. Places like Iran, also China, the lockdown protests. There were 69 universities that had protests, including Xi Jinping's alma mater. So there is a reaction against authoritarianism going on. And this is because it is increasingly being revealed to be an unsustainable, incompetent system. And I'm talking about something that is going to be manifesting more and more later. We've seen in Russia, sometimes it's an event like the war that reveals the incompetence. This happened in fascist Italy. It's happening in Putin's Russia. And so although authoritarians have not always been defeated, as in Turkey, where the incompetence and corruption of the government was revealed after the earthquake, the opposition came far closer to winning, considering how long Erdogan's been in power. So I'll stop there, but it's a very dramatic moment, kind of a peak moment, if you look at things on a global frame, as I like to do.
Very much. That was a model of concision. Rafael, your turn.
Thank you. Thank you, Ken, and thank you, my distinguished colleagues here, and of course for the HH organizing such a timely and important event. So it's a pleasure and privilege to be partaking in this conversation, which I agree with Ruth is absolutely, perhaps extremely relevant today, more than in many decades until now. I have lots to say, so I know we're going to have different moments here to say things, but I'm going to just kind of add a few kind of general comments for now. First, I think it's important whenever we're thinking of a country that now we call part of the global South, but used to be called, developing world, such as, the region of Latin America, countries of Latin America. It's not to essentialize it. So not to assume that there's anything inherently undemocratic or wrong with democracy there. I think democracy faces liberal democracy. As we call it more precisely, I would assume, faces challenges throughout the world, as Ruth just mentioned, as well as in different parts of Latin America today. Not because I want to start there. There is anything inherent, or has been historically anything inherently problematic about implementation of democratic values and democratic institutions in Latin America, and let alone not because of Latin American societies have not tried to pursue the implementation of democratic institutions and the cherishing of democratic values. In a historical context, actually, from the beginning of what's called modern Latin American countries, most of them became independent early in the 1800s. Democratic values were part of that process for independence from colonial rule, and democratic values and institutions were attempted to be put in place right then in the first years after independence in the 18-teens, 1820s. But yes, indeed, that implementation faced significant challenges. Because the ruling elites could not agree on resolving their differences largely, in many cases, not always, but in many cases, through democratic peaceful means, or democratic for the time being, Republican means at that time, and especially because they could not agree on sharing the democratic space and the political arena, as well as the economic, cultural arena, educational arenas, with broader social segments which were seen as not belonging to the citizenry because they were not white enough, or they were not educated enough, and so forth. But that did not prevent the continued pursuit of democratic values and democratic institutions in the region. There was an awakening, sort of a wave of democratic institutions in Latin America in the first decade, second decade, especially of the 20th century, right after World War II. But yes, it has been continually difficult to maintain those institutions. So yes, the history of Latin America has been largely defined by kind of failure of the continuity of democratic institutions. In the Cold War, largely that was done through, the traditional military coups that removed from power politicians, even though elected, but were seen as not acceptable by the establishment, the domestic and regional hemispheric establishments of status quo, the oligarchic establishments of Latin America, as well as often the United States government in the Cold War. But if in the Cold War, that was a traditional way to remove from power the undesirable governments, more recently, I'm trying to get to the present, lawfare initiatives, lawfare measures have been the main way to remove from power from either competing in the elections. And I agree with Ruth that often these authoritarian leaders are coming to power through actually the electoral process, which is being undermined in its own implementations by removing undesirable candidates such as happening right now in Guatemala, or is being attempted to be pursued now in Guatemala. But it happened clearly in Brazil in 2018 when Lula was proscribed from running against Bolsonaro, leading to the victory of Bolsonaro, the most important neo-fascist authoritarian leader of Latin America in the recent times. So lawfare has been the main instrument. So prohibiting candidates from running, and even when they are in power, finding ways to remove them from power, impeach them. Again, happened in Brazil in 2016, but it has happened in Peru, it has happened elsewhere. The situation in El Salvador is very concerning, as well as, eroding also a political independence of the legislative or the judiciary. So there are many things and many reasons to be concerned, as well as on the left side of the countries such as Nicaragua and Venezuela. But there are signs of hope. Colombia managed to transfer power to the first elected sort of candidate outside of the traditional oligarchic parties, a leftist president in power today, Gustavo Petro, and Lula has come back to power in Brazil. So the democratic institutions in Brazil, even though they were attacked and to some extent eroded under Bolsonaro, they survived the Bolsonaro threat, and Brazilian society now is trying to rebuild its democratic institutions. So again, I think we need to continue to be monitoring the what's happening in Latin America echoes events happening in many other parts of the world. It's very hard to understand the Bolsonaro phenomenon without linking it to actual specific connections, but it's actually also in terms of the modeling that he did and his group did after Trump. So again, U.S. Latin American relations continue to be very relevant to events in Latin America. But again, I think Latin American societies, I'm not sure if I'm as optimistic as Ruth, but clearly societies have mobilized against the deepening of authoritarianism in the region, and there are continuing signs of concern. I think we need to kind of find some hope in what happened in specific the countries that I mentioned, but we could add Chile, we could add other countries in the region to pay attention to, and see what's happening and to continue to monitor the threats of democracy in the region today. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you. So in East and Southeast Asia, democracy has traditionally had a hard time, and certainly it faces enormous challenges today, and yet crisis of democracy may be an overstatement for the region, and it's worth thinking about why. After all, Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea, the area's strongest democracies, have faced many of the same socioeconomic problems that have fueled the crisis in the West: slowing, or in Japan's case, non-existent growth over the last few years, rising inequality, and disappearing blue-collar jobs, lost in many cases to China, a backlash against moves towards greater gender equality, and so on. Yet Taiwan's democracy, barely 40 years old, is exceptionally robust. And Japan's and Korea's, though more troubled, remain quite functional, with relatively little of the pseudo-populist reaction that has troubled so many democracies elsewhere, though the blatant misogyny of President Yoon's successful campaign last year in South Korea is a warning sign. In Indonesia, there are some significant problems with the repression of civil rights for non-Muslims, but elections are generally considered free, fair, and competitive, and overall, there are probably more positive trends than negative ones there. Only the Philippines and perhaps Thailand, I think, really fit well with the model of a once functioning democracy, and that was some time ago, increasingly disrupted by violence, disinformation, and the state machinery itself being used to prevent real political competition. Elsewhere in the region, there is a trend towards increasing authoritarianism and repression that's very much worrisome. But that's essentially a matter of states that could never have been called democratic, recently becoming even more repressive. China, including Hong Kong, Vietnam, Burma, and in China's case, a problem of domestic repression increasingly being projected abroad in attacks against dissidents living in other countries. But still, this is not quite the same phenomenon as what we've seen in places like Hungary, the United States, etc. So what's different about the relatively successful outliers of Taiwan, Korea, and Japan? In two cases, I think it's partly a nearby threat that has arguably had a unifying effect from North Korea and China respectively, though I'm not sure how far you can push that explanation. After all, Taiwanese are deeply divided over how to deal with China, and to some extent, South Koreans are also quite divided over how to deal with the North. And of course, a powerful, meddlesome neighbor is not necessarily good for democracy. The low profile of immigration in all three of these countries is also suggestive, though the issue is not entirely absent, especially in Taiwan, and contrary to mythology, ethnic division is very much part of the politics of all these countries, most of all Taiwan. But admittedly, there hasn't been a sudden upsurge in the issue of immigration, even remotely comparable to what's happened in much of Europe as Middle Eastern and African refugees began turning up in greatly increased numbers after the destabilization of the Iraq War, Arab Spring, etc. The absence of recent failed wars and angry, sometimes traumatized veterans is a notable contrast between these countries and, for instance, the United States, but not a contrast with all countries suffering democratic crisis. It would take a lot more research to determine which of these differences are the important ones, but I think they do suggest some things, including the hopeful note that the pain of economic restructuring and even stagnation, while certainly bad in itself, need not be a mortal threat to democracy. Again, the Taiwanese and South Korean cases are particularly instructive here. Indeed, the strength of democracy among young people, in particular in Korea, Vietnam, and arguably Indonesia, and as Ruth noted, the growth of impressive protest movements, Hong Kong, to some extent the Chinese mainland, etc., even in places where people face enormous repression, is really striking, and striking in part because so many of the people who seem to be willing to take risks for democracy are people who, in socioeconomic terms, are frequently quite alienated from their societies. They're people don't always have that much socioeconomic reason to defend democratic institutions. And the fact that they are willing to do so anyway is a genuine ray of hope. So I'll stop there and turn things over to Paul.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be part of this panel. I want to begin where Rafael began, and that is the fact that when we look at the trajectory of democracy in Africa, in terms of periodization, I think we have to begin with the struggles for independence. The embodied, of course, desires by the African peoples to participate more actively in the affairs of their own countries, because obviously colonialism was a very authoritarian system. So the democratic project really starts in earnest with the struggles for independence. And then, a lot of the states that took over, many of them became autocratic for all sorts of complicated reasons. And then there's going to be a second wave, what in the African literature is called the struggle for the second independence, which emerges from the 1980s and escalates in the 1990s and 2000s. Began in Western Africa, spreads to Eastern and Southern Africa, and then, of course, we know in Northern Africa, at the beginning of this century, from 2011, the Arab Spring that engulfed the region. In trying to explain why these transitions have taken place, of course, there's a lot of debate, which I'll be quite happy to share later on. Just to point out that again, to echo what Ruth said, while there are a lot of challenges taking place, and Africa, of course, is a huge continent with 55 different countries, so it's very difficult to generalize. So while there have been some challenges, including, of course, most recently, we saw the coup in Niger and so on, and a few other coups in West Africa, the picture is a lot more mixed. So I share Kenneth's point that perhaps the word crisis might be, overdrawn for the entire continent. There are pockets where there is a crisis, and there are other areas in which I think there are struggles to consolidate democratic rule. What is quite interesting is that in the struggles for democracy across Africa, there are really different visions of what democracy entails. Again, if there is time, I would be quite happy to elaborate. There is what some people would call the nativist model. Democracy, those people say that it can only be consolidated if it is articulated with the consultative model of democracy found in traditional institutions. Then, of course, there is the liberal model, the popular democratic model, and there is also very interestingly a theocratic model, and then what I call a transnational model of democratic governance. The contemporary scene, is facing challenges with regards to democratic consolidation, as I indicated, things to do with erosion of civil liberties in some places, manipulation of electoral processes, concentration of power in the hands of ruling parties, weakening of independent institutions, erosions of rule of law, restrictions of media freedoms, and manipulation of constitutions, and erosion of minority rights, religious or ethnic minorities, and of course the use of patronage. However, what you are seeing is also, as was pointed out by Ruth, this continued series of struggles for democracy, led by civil society organization, youth and student activists, women's rights activists and organizations, labor unions and work organizations, opposition parties, of course, human rights defenders, religious leaders and traditional authorities, and obviously intellectuals and academics, journalists, media organizations, bloggers, you name it. And of course, also the deployment of transnational justice and human rights commissions. And more recently, of course, in the last 2 decades, the rise of digital activists. And all these people are really fighting for electoral integrity, rule of law and human rights, anti-corruption, media freedom and freedom of expression, youth engagement, gender equality, civic education, you name it. And of course, a lot of peaceful protests, demonstrations, and grassroots mobilization taking place all over the place, particularly where there's democratic freedoms that people fought very hard, not only for independence, but also in the second independence are being trampled upon. I'll stop there.
Hey, thanks very much. And thank you to all the panelists for staying within time. That was great. And that allows us to go through a second round where I think people should feel free to comment on anything that occurred to them listening to each other. But I'd also like people to particularly think about the question of, are there lessons from your region in particular that you think are particularly helpful for people elsewhere in the world interested in defending democracy to really take to heart? And let's just go in the same order and start once again with Ruth Ben-Ghiat.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks to everyone for their presentations. There's a lot of rich material to comment on. I mentioned, one thing already, which is we all think about fascism in the Hitler model, but that's not as useful actually as thinking about Mussolini, who was a prime minister in a democracy and slowly chipped away, and then actually declared dictatorship to escape a corruption and murder, trial that was going to send him possibly to prison. Very contemporary. And we see this today. One of the main things that's developed in the 21st century is, regular politicians, if you're under investigation or indictment, you don't want to run for office because, there's opposition research, there's journalists will investigate you. But strong men, as I call them, they don't think like other people. And it's exactly the time to run for office because they have to get back into power so they can, or get into power the first time so they can shut down all the journalists and the courts and be able to feel safe. And so there's an old pattern of this, and Putin ran for office under investigation. Berlusconi in Italy, Berlusconi is a very important teacher of what's going on now. 3 times. Trump, this is his 3rd time running while under investigation or indictment. And Netanyahu is a big drama in Israel because Netanyahu came back and he's been indicted for several things, and he's trying to immediately shut down judicial independence. So I'm saying this because it can be very helpful. History doesn't only create patterns that we can use to understand historical change itself and understand the present. I've found that knowing these patterns actually has, in my public work and also in my scholarly work, allowed me to anticipate what's going to happen in the future and to recognize certain playbooks that are going on. An example that gets into Rafael's terrain, Chile, the coup, we all know the coup was 1973, it was US backed, but it was preceded by 3 years of a very important playbook that had the participation of the Brazilians. These things are transnational, of many Chilean right-wing conservative elites. And it included economic warfare. So when I see things in the world today, the US Republicans trying to kind of default on the debt ceiling, to kind of wreck the economy, the convoy movement, that has an echo back to Chile, where they had truck strikes. The idea is to show that democracy doesn't work, that it's chaos, it's anarchy, it's foreigners coming over the border. That's a line used from everyone, from Mussolini, Pinochet, Trump, everybody uses this line. So if you know these histories and you are able to recognize patterns of ideologies, of propaganda, of policies, you're able to, in the classroom and in your work, have a better sense of what is going on today and how it is informed by history, and thus have a better sense of what the danger level is, because this is a webinar about democracy, what the danger level is and what to do about it. Very important. What the heck to do about it? And there too, there are playbooks that have come down to us from the past of resistance that we can know about and use. And this is why, to conclude, history is so scary and threatening to certain kinds of governors and certain kinds of national leaders all over the world.
Great. Rafael?
Sure. And thank you, Ruth. That was great to hear. It's reassuring, right? To know that you're not alone by thinking along very similar lines. So I agree, and by having the privilege to listen to everyone, I'd like to add on different comments, including Ken's, that yes, misinformation was also a very important instrument, right, in the erosion of democratic institutions in Latin America, including in the failed attempt to write a new constitution from moving away from the Pinochet's constitution put in place in Chile in 1980, in a very promising, very progressive constitution in Chile, and that plebiscite was defeated because of extensive use of misinformation and fake news also behind the election of Bolsonaro. So again, the echoes and the parallels, what's happening elsewhere in the world are very strongly felt in Latin America. So I just wanted to go back a little bit quickly to the Cold War situation to get to the question. So after the end of the Cold War in the 90s, right, given the history of Latin America, the long attempted history of 200 years almost, trying to implement democratic institutions that had been curtailed largely by the Cold War. The Cold War curtailed, I think, democratic projects in many parts of the global South, right? I tried to connect a little bit also with Paul there, including in Latin America. So in the 90s, it was the sort of sense and perhaps naive sense to some, even though there were very strong opposition, and not as clear then opposition to that, but it was believed that the democracy could now finally be pursued. But also the 1990s was a time when neoliberalism kind of really shaped Latin America, not only the economic landscape, but also political and even cultural landscape. So increased inequality. And I think one of the things we should really pay attention to, and I think that goes beyond Latin America, is that it cannot only be liberal democracy in the sense of just voting every 4 years or every 2 years in the case of the United States, but it has to be, people have to have a sense of inclusion, which goes beyond the right to vote, a sense that they have a shared involvement in the destiny of the collective, of us as a society. So that has to entail economic, socioeconomic rights and inclusion and cultural rights as well. So in the 90s, that initial belief that democracy would finally unfold was really not the case. There was beginning to lose momentum on that. And in the early 2000s I would say, was one of the most democratic, not only politically, but also socioeconomic inclusion, highest moments in Latin America. And that was chipped and curtailed in many countries by a new oligarchic movement in the region in the recent years, in the last decade or so. So I would bring that as a sort of a, not a lesson, but something we really need to pay attention to. In addition to this idea of the strong man and this misinformation, is that unless we provide a deeper sense and a broader multidimensional sense of inclusion, why would people be supporting the democracy if their lives, they feel that their lives are being eroded in other dimensions? I think with that, it speaks loudly to the Trump phenomenon to some extent, right? People feeling that, I don't have much to defend in the society as it is today because I don't feel included in different ways. Of course, it goes beyond it, very complicated matters of cultural transformations and racial transformations in the country. But I'm trying to just kind of go back to the neoliberal wave, which came back in a more authoritarian fashion under Bolsonaro. So it's not surprising to see that would actually echo beyond the traditional oligarchies, but with broader segments of the people, because people felt that, it's okay if we have the strong man fixing things because the country is not really including me anymore. So I think that's something we need to pay attention, and I think goes beyond countries like Brazil or Latin America, but echoes other parts of the world as well.
Thanks. I want to pick up on this idea of inclusion, because I think it's absolutely critical, but also really complicated, right? So, as I mentioned before, if you were to look at certain measures of inclusion and of neoliberal economics, a place like South Korea or Taiwan, or Japan for that matter, has suffered in many of the same ways as the so-called advanced democracies in the West have, right? You've seen blue-collar incomes really hammered, a lot of loss of blue-collar jobs, increased inequality, etc. In places where democratic institutions, didn't have particularly deep roots, and yet those democracies have survived, and in fact have survived pretty well. And I don't think that tells us that, oh no, Rafael is wrong, inclusion doesn't matter. But I think what it does suggest is how complicated inclusion is, and that it can proceed along a bunch of different fronts, right? So that if you were to look at, say, income inequality in Taiwan, it has worsened in the same way as in a lot of other industrialized societies, and for the same reason. But unlike, say, the United States, Taiwan did healthcare reform. They really made it universal, right? Whereas we took only baby steps. They've made dramatic changes in the last few years towards including their indigenous population politically in a way that they hadn't before. And yeah, there's been some backlash against it, but nothing like the backlash that you've had in the United States against attempts to create a more equal multiracial society. And in fact, I think one of the really encouraging lessons of the Taiwanese case in particular is that you often hear from certain kinds of, let's call them centrist Democrats, that in order to defend democracy, you have to go slow. You can't be too ambitious. Taiwan is a place where, again, it was under martial law until 1987. Democracy doesn't have terribly deep roots. They've moved incredibly fast on a whole bunch of social fronts in the last 20 years. And it's worked. It does suggest that, at least under some circumstances, pretty impressive moves towards social democracy do not have to leave you vulnerable because you've gotten out in front of the population. I mean, this is a deeply Confucian society that has nonetheless taken really important steps towards gender equity in the last 20 years. Not much backlash. It's quite striking. I'm not sure I understand it, but it does suggest that the range of possibilities may be less cramped than we sometimes fear. Okay, let me turn it over to Paul.
Thank you. This is very rich conversation, so thank you. I think for Africa to respond to your question, there are three things perhaps that distinctive. Obviously, they're not unique to the continent, but that people in other parts of the world might want to pay attention to. And one is that there is an expansive view in many circles, whether you're talking of social activists or you're talking to intellectuals, an expansive view of what democracy should be beyond liberal democracy, the minimalist democracy of good governance, periodic elections, and so on. And really an interest in building what are popularly called democratic developmental states to overcome the colonial and post-colonial underdevelopment, and also to merge the three generations of human rights, the political and civil rights, which of course, entrenched in liberal democracies, and then economic and social rights, which tend to be missing in many of those democracies, and they are very important for the people who are fighting for independence, and certainly their successors, and then solidarity rights, rights to the environment. People are looking for beyond the traditional conceptions that we might be familiar with in this part of the world. And I think it's important for people from this part of the world to really pay attention to discourses on democracy in other parts of the world, in this case, Africa. The second point is that there is a remarkable resilience of social movements, often fighting against great odds. When you look at the history of African democratic struggles, from the early 20th century to the present, what strikes you is how resilient these movements have been over a very long period of time, and as I said, against very great odds. And then finally, these movements enjoy quite complex connections and understanding with not only movements across the continent. For example, the Arab Spring, emerges from Tunisia, spreads to other parts of North Africa and to Western Asia, what we popularly call the Middle East, and so on. And the end of apartheid in South Africa in 1994 is also going to have demonstration effects and reverberations across the continent in terms of the kind of a developmental democratic state that the African National Congress was trying to establish. And so people pay attention to what's going on around the world. Of course, Africa was very much involved in the creation of the non-aligned movement, the G77, the UN. And one thing which you find talking to a lot of African academics and activists is a resentment against being preached at. They bristle at the idea of mature and immature democracies, believing that democracy is a project you always have to fight for. And I think in the United States, we have learned that democratic institutions can be very brittle, and if people don't pay attention, they can be undermined severely.
Thank you. And again, thanks to everybody for being concise. This leaves us enough time for sort of a lightning round where I think we can each talk for maybe 3 minutes. And one way to focus it might be to pick up on something Paul mentioned briefly, which is the work of digital activists advocating for democracy. But let me broaden that a little bit by asking each of you to say something about the media environment and about technology more generally, including perhaps surveillance technology, and the ways in which this does or doesn't render the lessons of history, if not irrelevant, at least fragile. So let's start again with Ruth.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. There is the reason I wrote Strongmen was not just as an American seeing Trump come on the scene and recognizing what he was doing. I thought it was time to look back on a century of authoritarianism, and I organized the book into chapters, each one going over 100 years of the so-called tools of rule. And so I have propaganda, corruption, machismo, violence, other things. And one of the sub-themes is how, in the Greater Nation chapter, is how, authoritarians go after exiles. This is very important. And it became a sub-theme of the book, that both in terms of the massive numbers of exiles who become a nation outside the nation. This is one of the tragedies of when democracy is defeated. But the way that authoritarians use whatever instruments they had at that time to go after them. Often it's very low tech, like Gaddafi just had people showing up and shooting dissidents abroad. Today you have digital surveillance. It's a huge problem, but it is important to put that in what's going on today. Surveillance makes things far, far easier. It also makes it introduces a different, all the digital sphere introduces a different playbook for policing protests at home. For example, in China, again, very unusual. It was a single issue protest, but quite widespread. As I said, it's a big deal that there were 79 universities having protests. And they didn't shut them down right away. They allowed them to go. And because they are a model in the world of a negative model, if you believe in democracy, for surveillance technology. And then they rounded some of them up later. That's one way to do it, instead of just going in there with your police, getting a bad name in front of the cameras of the world. So digital tools are changing the way. However, and I have this in my book, activists are very digital savvy, and they know how to use the tools of social media today to get to not only expose what's going on to them in real time, but also to create communities of sympathy for their cause. An example, in 2019, during the big protests in Russia, in Moscow particularly, one of the classic scenes, anybody here who studies dissent, is that the police, the secret police, whatever thugs they are, they come in your apartment, they raid you, they take away, in the old days, the papers with the names of your contacts. So one guy in Russia, he had a hard drive, and he sent a drone. He put it in a drone and he sent it to safety, but he filmed it on social media, I think on Twitter. So everybody saw the drone taking away the hard drive with all of his contacts to safety as the police came in, from Putin's police. So this was something that went viral. So it strikes both ways, and both have a history. So I find it very compelling to students when you put today's things in a history, and thus you're also doing a history of technology, a history of how technology changes methods of policing and also resistance.
Okay, Rafael.
Sure. So quickly, I think it's interesting. It goes into different phases. I think in the early 2000s, new communication options were really the space for progressives in many countries, right? It was for use of political inclusion and social movements, grassroots movements, and so forth. But I think when new platforms came in, especially in Brazil, like WhatsApp and here Twitter, the not just the right, I'm not going to call them the right, but just the anti-democratic right, anti-democratic forces were much more, clever in utilizing them for their purposes. But so what's to be done there? Well, first, I think platforms need to not only be self-regulated, but there should be some standards, that should be abided by them. They should be abiding and maybe in something to be deliberated, not just country by country, but even beyond that. And that's especially acutely problematic for countries like in the global South, because the platforms are not based in the South, and it's very hard for them to establish their own standards that are not going to be able to, impact them if the platform is based in Silicon Valley and so forth. But beyond that, and it's something that is I'm not sure how the United States authorities are going to deal with it, or the United States society is going to deal with it, because there's this quintessentially philosophical notion of freedom of speech as almost like an absolute, but that's not universal. Many countries do not see that, you can say anything as an absolute right. Like in Brazil now, they are debating and they have put in place restrictions, right, to specific things you can say online if they are detrimental to the democratic environment. And that could certainly be an option that other countries could pursue as a way to kind of minimize the negative side of what is a good thing, right? The more voices being able to express their views in a public debate in a conceptual sense should be seen as a good thing. But of course, that depends on how you go about handling those things. So I just want to finish. I don't think I'm going to have an opportunity to speak again by agreeing with Paul. And there was another point I wanted to sort of conclude, saying that, yes, I think one of the lessons by what's happening in Latin America more recently is that democracy is not a done deal. The democratic consolidation perhaps is never done, never over, but it's an ongoing thing, and it has to be pursued by that notion of inclusion and voices as well as in other dimensions of life. Thank you.
Thanks. So Paul just reminded us that democracy is never a done deal. I think the other thing to remember is that authoritarianism is not a done deal either. Authoritarians screw up, and sometimes their screwing up has consequences for them. I think about China, and as recently as 7-8 years ago, if people asked me, what do you wish Americans knew about China that they don't? One of my go-to answers was always, it's much more decentralized than you think. And that was partly because Chinese leaders for centuries had realized the darn place was too big to really rule effectively just from Beijing. And so the party would have half a dozen things they really cared about. On that, you darn well better toe the line. But the understanding was always that if you toe the line on the half dozen things that we really, really care about, we will turn a blind eye to an awful lot of local variation in other things. And that, on the bad side, enabled a lot of local corruption. But on the good side, it created a lot of the spaces of freedom and opportunities for experimentation that existed. Technology in the last decade or so has given Beijing at least the illusion that maybe they don't need that bargain anymore. Maybe some combination of polling, AI, etc., will enable them to aggregate enough data about individual preferences that they can actually have the information to rule everything down to the grassroots. It's a terrifying ambition, but it's terrifying both because they could succeed, but I suspect they're also likely to screw up, and screw up big time. And there may be democratic possibilities that come out of that. So let me give Paul the last word.
Yeah, I think we saw the power of social media, kind of digital democratization, as it were, in terms of mobilizing during the Arab Spring. Since then, it has escalated in many parts of Africa, where particularly the youth, of course, were very savvy at using technology, really use social media to organize. And then secondly, it's also, I think, the point that was made earlier about the diasporas. For Africa, African diasporas have always been very critical, in the struggles for democracy. So if you read the histories of the civil rights movement in the United States and histories of nationalism in Africa, you see there are a lot of reverberations and connections. People like Harry Belafonte, I just finished reading his autobiography. He moves back and forth between what he was doing with Dr. Martin Luther King and the rest of this civil rights movement and what he was doing in Africa. And of course, we know during the struggle for, against apartheid, the Congressional Black Caucus in Congress and other forums, churches, trade unions, universities, of course, played a major role in trying to bring that system down. And then finally, with regards to things, the surveillance state, a lot of countries are investing in spyware, and of course, in collaboration with the Chinese interested in surveillance. Perhaps the saving grace is that many of them don't have the kinds of resources to really go and invest, and not their entire populations are connected as much as perhaps it might be the case in other parts of the world. And as was pointed out, the young people are usually a step ahead of these sort of older policymakers and rulers and so on. By the time they catch up, the young people have moved on.
Thank you very much to Paul, to Rafael, to Ruth. And I will turn things back now to Jim and to Jake to bring us to a conclusion.
So this concludes today's panel, which I have certainly learned many things from, and I hope everybody else did as well. I hope that we have been helpful, productive. Please watch our calendar actually right now. We're working on the possibility of a session in the next few weeks, which will be a little more often than usual, on some obvious controversial issues relating to history education. We'll see if we can pull that off. We hope we can. Everybody who registered for today's webinar will receive a follow-up email with a link to a recording of today's event as soon as we can share it. If you're already a member of the AHA, thank you. If you're not a member, we hope you will join today. If you found this useful, entertaining, valuable, or any other positive adjective you can think of, please think about joining. We can't do any of this work without members. And finally, we want to thank our moderator, all of our panelists, for giving so generously of their time today. As everybody knows, the donation of time is not just the hour that we're here, but preparation. And we appreciate all the work that goes into participating. We also want to thank all of our attendees for spending this hour with us. Most of you, indeed, it was just an hour. If you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to contact us.